I want to invite you to take your Bibles and join me in Genesis 34. If you're using the blue ESV Bible and the seat backs out there, you can find our text on page 28. We're in Genesis 34. We will be considering the whole chapter, and the title of our sermon is Dinah. In Genesis 49, Jacob, on his deathbed, calls his sons together to impart to them the patriarchal blessing. And at that point, he has 12 sons, and he essentially refuses to bless his first 3 sons. We'll see next week why he skips over Reuben and strips him, his firstborn, of his preeminence. But today, we see the cause of his indignation toward Simeon and Levi, his second and thirdborn sons. This is what he says of them in Genesis 49. Simeon and Levi are brothers. Weapons of violence are their swords. Let my soul come not into their counsel. O my glory, be not joined to their company. For in their anger they killed men, and in their willfulness the hamstrung oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. What could make a father say such things about his sons? Well, this is what our text today helps us to see. We saw last week in Genesis 33 that Jacob had reconciled with his brother Esau, from whom he had fled upwards of 30 years ago at this point. We saw at the very end of the chapter that Jacob had also crossed back over the Jordan River. He had re-entered Canaan in a near fulfillment of his vow to the Lord back in Genesis 28 when he was fleeing Esau. The Lord would take care of him, protect him, provide him, keep his word to him. Jacob would come back to Bethel. Now we see next week in Genesis 35, Jacob actually does get to Bethel, his intended destination within the promised land, where God had first appeared to him, had made promises to him. But last week he stopped short, and here, in between the arrival in Canaan and the actual arrival at Bethel within Canaan, we have this chapter, Genesis 34, this ever-distressing narrative. At a structural level, Genesis 34 balances Genesis 26 within the generations of Isaac narrative. Each of these 2 chapters discusses one of the patriarchs' interactions with the Canaanites. They involve themes of intercourse, deception, and strife. In Genesis 26, Isaac's wife Rebekah is nearly taken by Abimelech, king of the Philistines. In Genesis 34, Dinah, Jacob's daughter, is actually taken by Shechem. In both cases, the patriarch fails to protect his wife or daughter from threat. But in both cases, the patriarch escapes unharmed and with not an insignificant increase in wealth. This was also Abraham's experience on 2 occasions with his wife, Sarah. These chapters taken together then, on the one hand, they tie the 3 patriarchs together, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and their respective failures to deal faithfully with the people surrounding them, especially those in Canaan as it regards the women in their homes. And this chapter also serves, as I said at the very outset, that this serves as crucial background for Jacob's blessing of his sons in Genesis 49. And that's important because it helps us to understand life in the nation of Israel in the Exodus and beyond. So let's read the chapter together, give an outline, and we'll get working on it together. Chapter 34, verse 1. Now Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to see the women of the land. And when Shechem, the son of Hamor the Hivite, the prince of the land, saw her, he seized her and lay with her and humiliated her. And his soul was drawn to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob. He loved the young woman and spoke tenderly to her. So Shechem spoke to his father Hamor, saying, "Get me this girl for my wife." Now Jacob heard that he had defiled his daughter Dinah. But his sons were with his livestock in the field. So Jacob held his peace until they came. And Hamor, the father of Shechem, went out to Jacob to speak with him. The sons of Jacob had come in from the field as soon as they heard of it, and the men were indignant and very angry because he had done an outrageous thing in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter. For such a thing must not be done. But Hamor spoke with them, saying, "The soul of my son Shechem longs for your daughter. Please give her to him to be his wife. Make marriages with us. Give your daughters to us and take our daughters for yourselves. You shall deal with us, and the land shall be open to you. Dwell and trade in it and get property in it." Shechem also said to her father and to her brothers, "Let me find favor in your eyes, and whatever you say to me I will give. Ask me for as great a bride price and gift as you will, and I will give whatever you say to me. Only give me the young woman to be my wife." The sons of Jacob answered Shechem and his father Hamor deceitfully because he had defiled their sister Dinah. They said to him, "We cannot do this thing, to give our sister to one who is uncircumcised, for that would be a disgrace to us. Only on this condition will we agree with you, that you will become as we are, by every male among you being circumcised. Then we will give our daughter to you, and we will take your daughters to ourselves, and we will deal with you and become one people. But if you will not listen to us and be circumcised, then we will take our daughter, and we will be gone." Their words pleased Hamor and Hamor's son Shechem. And the young man did not delay to do the thing, because he delighted in Jacob's daughter. Now he was the most honored of all his father's house. So Hamor and his son Shechem came to the gate of the city and spoke to the men of their city, saying, "These men are at peace with us. Let them dwell in the land and trade in it. For behold, the land is large enough for them. Let us take their daughters as wives. Let us give them our daughters. Only on this condition will the men agree to dwell with us, to become one people, when every male among us is circumcised as they are circumcised. Will not their livestock, their property, and all their beasts be ours? Only let us agree with them, and they will dwell with us." And all who went out of the gate of his city listened to Hamor and his son Shechem, and every male was circumcised, all who went out of the gate of his city. On the third day, when they were sore, two of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took their swords and came against the city while it felt secure and killed all the males. They killed Hamor and his son Shechem with the sword and took Dinah out of Shechem's house and went away. The sons of Jacob came upon the slain and plundered the city because they had defiled their sister. They took their flocks and their herds, their donkeys, and whatever was in the city and in the field, all their wealth, all their little ones and their wives, all that was in the houses, they captured and plundered. Then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, "You have brought trouble on me by making me stink to the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites and the Perizzites. My numbers are few. They gather themselves against me and attack me. I shall be destroyed, both I and my household." But they said, "Should he treat our sister like a prostitute?" The narrative unfolds here along three basic lines. First, we witness in verses 1 to 4 a defilement. Second, we witness in verses 5 through 24 a deception. And third, we witness a destruction in verses 25 to 31. So if you like alliteration, there you have it. Defilement, deception, and destruction will be the hooks on which we hang this sermon. Let's look in the first place, the first 4 verses where we see a defilement. The chapter opens innocently enough. Now Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to see the women of the land. But there really are a few things we need to note about this opening sentence, some things to observe. Everything that we've seen regarding this family thus far has shown us that favoritism has played a significant role in Jacob's home. And pretty much everything we will read going forward from here will show the same. And so when we read about Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, we need to keep this in mind. We need to not forget the favoritism, the strife, the preference, the division that already exists within this family. We met Leah back in chapter 30, verse 21. Leah bore a daughter and called her name Dinah. And now here she is, probably a teenager at this point. And she goes out to see the women of the land. And given the preferences that Jacob has shown in his family that have led to problems among his wives, we now begin to see the effect it has upon his children. Dinah would likely have benefited from a better relationship with her father. Her interest in the women of the land here and her going out to see them, while not really explained what is going on there, and it certainly is no justification for what happens to her, it is the occasion of what happens to her. And we may describe it as perhaps a bit improper or imprudent. And yet, while we may suggest that she should not have had such interest in getting to know these ladies, our gaze cannot help but drift toward Jacob, who seemingly fails to give her any substantial fatherly love, guidance, or protection. This is more of an inference based on how he responds to this event rather than anything directly stated here. Because what ends up happening is that she goes out, wanders into an area, where she shouldn't have been, and then comes this horrible act against her. We meet this man, or really meet him again, this man Shechem, the son of Hamor, the Hivite. We met him at the end of Genesis 33. Jacob had exchanged some business with them. He had bought some land. Hamor is king. Shechem, his oldest or favorite son, is prince of the land. And he sees Dinah, and in this very quick succession, the narrator relates to us a horrific act that Shechem commits against Dinah. He saw her, he seized her, he lay with her, and humiliated her. The piling up of words here makes it quite clear that this is not a consensual act, particularly with the last word and its humiliation, this affliction that he put upon her. What's also interesting to note is that this is this pattern of seeing, taking, and devouring or consuming or something like that is a pattern that we find elsewhere in Scripture. A pattern that identifies sinful and wicked behavior. We saw it in Genesis 3. Eve saw the fruit on the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. She took it and she ate it. Here, Shechem sees Dinah. He takes her and devours her. In Joshua 7, Achan will do a similar thing. He will see, take the treasure. And yet, rather than casting Dinah off after this horrific experience, which we might expect him to use her and lose her, his soul is drawn to her, drawn to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob. Now, naming her here in verse 3 as Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, again, our attention is drawn to Jacob. This is Jacob's daughter. And once more, highlights his failure as a father. His name occurs many times in this passage, but he is very inactive in this passage. And so we read that Shechem, his soul is drawn to her, he loved the young woman, and he spoke tenderly to her. Now, if that tempts us to view him with any level of sympathy or pity, or maybe he's not such a bad guy, his immediate summoning of his father to go and get me this girl for my wife betrays him as rather arrogant, callous to the horror of what he has just done. So in 4 short verses here, we see this defilement, and we see another female in the household of a patriarch in trouble. But this time it isn't simply the threat of trouble. Abraham's wife Sarah was under the threat of trouble, but the Lord intervened and saved. Isaac's wife Rebekah was under the threat of trouble, but the Lord intervened and saved. But here, for reasons left only to him that we are not told, the Lord doesn't intervene and save the daughter of Jacob. She was seemingly left to her own devices by a rather unaffectionate, absentee father. She was violated and defiled by an uncircumcised Canaanite, and now she is at risk of being kept in this pagan home permanently by way of marriage. And so in verses 5 to 24, then we see a deception that follows this defilement. We're told that Jacob has learned of Dinah's defilement. And you would probably assume, if you were reading this for the first time, that the next sentence would be something like this. And Jacob gathered his sons and made ready for war. Or, at least, and Jacob sent a very strongly worded email to Shechem, CCing Hamor and Dinah's 11 brothers. But we don't get anything of the sort. Jacob's sons are out in the field tending to the livestock, and so Jacob keeps his mouth shut. His apathy is striking and distressing. When Jacob's sons return and they learn of the thing, they are, by way of significant contrast, enraged. The text says they are indignant and very angry. Why? Because Shechem had done an outrageous thing in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter. For such a thing must not be done. For the record, this phrase, someone doing an outrageous thing in Israel, it's later used in the Old Testament, the Torah especially, to describe behavior worthy of the death penalty. You see that in Deuteronomy 22, Joshua 7. And so they're angry because of this outrageous thing that Shechem has done. And so Hamor begins to speak. And yet neither from Hamor nor Shechem, who is there with him, comes any kind of apology. Not a confession of wrongdoing or even an acknowledgement that they are angry or in pain. He simply puts forward a marriage proposal, and he extends it to the entire family. We'll give you our daughters, you give us your daughters. There's a great economic advantage here. Some transactions to take place. This is a business transaction for him. He suggests full intermarriage between his family and Jacob's, a thing which will be explicitly condemned in the Torah later on. Speaking of the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, Deuteronomy 7:3 says, "You shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons or taking their daughters for your sons, for they would turn away your sons from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord would be kindled against you, and he would destroy you quickly. Now, obviously, at this point, it had not yet been proscribed by Mosaic law for Israelites to marry the Canaanites. But we already saw 10 chapters ago in Genesis 24 that when Abraham sought to obtain a wife for his son Isaac, what did he say to his servant? He made him swear. He said, "Put your hand under my thigh that I may make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I dwell, but will go to my country, to my kindred, and take a wife for my son Isaac." Similarly, when Isaac's son Esau, Jacob's brother, married the Hittite women of the land, what happened? They made life bitter for everyone. And then Isaac commands Jacob in Genesis 28, "You must not take a wife from the Canaanite women." So even before Deuteronomy 7, intermarriage between the Israelites and the Canaanites was unacceptable. And so should this proposal have been to Jacob. But as we'll see, he really doesn't have much to say about it. But furthermore, as one author put it, there is something else in this offer. Not just generic, don't marry these specific people for whatever reason. One author put it, there's something of a hiss in Hamor's offer. Dwelling prosperously in the land as their sons and daughters intermarry with one another, ostensibly having children together, that sounds eerily familiar. Similar to the blessing that God has been promising to Jacob's family all along. Seed, land, and a kingdom. Is Jacob here being offered a shortcut to the blessing by way of disobedience? It wouldn't be the first time such a thing has happened. It won't be the last. But before anybody can respond, Shechem interjects and he sweetens the pot. He says, "Look, name your price. Anything I can give, I will give it. Whatever you want." And it's at this point that we hear from Israel, but not from Jacob. Jacob either has no control on his sons or the situation, or he doesn't have anything to say at all. His sons respond, and they answer, we're told, deceitfully. And they raise not an economic, but a religious objection. It's not a matter of money between us, man. We can't consent to this intermarriage because of the issue of circumcision. We're circumcised, you're not. For us to give our sister to you, uncircumcised pagan that you are, would be a disgrace. Now, we aren't told immediately what is deceitful about this reply. We learn that soon. But immediately, all we're clued into is that they're not being genuine. The answer they give is motivated by this defilement that's occurred. Their sister has been defiled, and so they answer deceitfully. They tell them, hey, look, if you and all your men will be circumcised, arrangements may proceed. All of that sounds good. And they even end their response with probably a semi-veiled threat that if Hamor doesn't take up the offer, they will storm into Shechem's house, which is apparently where Dinah is being detained at this time. We're going to storm in, we're going to get her, and we're going to go. And so they make this proposal, but they aren't being entirely truthful about their motives or what they intend to do. And then in verse 18, picking up there, we see that Hamor and Shechem are quite pleased with this. They gather a hearing at the gate of the city, and they make a pitch to the people. And apparently, the sons of Jacob are not the only ones whose words don't mean quite what they seem. They tell the people, hey, these guys don't want to mess with us. They're at peace with us. Let's let them come in. Let them assimilate with us. Why? Verse 23, will not their livestock, their property, and all their beasts be ours? It's worth noting that twice in this passage, I think it's just twice, that this phrase, this idea of becoming one people is mentioned. Jacob's sons mention it, and Hamor mentions it to his town. The result of this transaction is that we will be one people. You know, the last time this phrase, one people, was used was Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel. For Israel to become one people with the Canaanites would have meant the destruction of God's covenant and God's plan to bring blessing to the nations through the seed of Abraham. If you don't hear the hiss, if we didn't hear the hiss in Hamor's offer of prosperity before, we really must hear it now. And so they convinced the city with apparently no discussion. The men of the town go right along with the plan. Shockingly. Every male is circumcised. And so, at the end of verse 24, the scene is set. Everyone who had gone out, circumcised. And this agreement has been reached, where each side is apparently poised to, in some measure, double-cross the other. So let's consider the destruction that follows in verses 25 to 31. 3 days later, when Hamor and his clan were sore from the citywide circumcision, and in an incredibly ironic twist, they are feeling secure. This word secure here, it's used elsewhere in the Torah to describe how God would cause Israel to dwell securely in the land after their slavery in Egypt and their return to the Promised Land. And so there's an irony here that we can't miss. And on the third day, two of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, they took their swords and killed every male in the city, ending with Hamor and Shechem. And they took Dinah, as they had threatened to do, took their sister and went back home. And then all the sons of Jacob, they came upon the slain and they plundered them. These scheming Shechemites, once sore, but dwelling securely in the land with God's covenant sign upon them and imagining how they would possess all that belonged to the Israelites, now lay dead as the sons of Israel take their pick of their flocks and their herds, their donkeys, and whatever was in the city and in the field. All their wealth, all their little ones and their wives, all that was in the houses they captured and plundered. And it is only now that Jacob finds his voice. About time. What does he say? Well, he utterly condemns Simeon and Levi. As we noted in the introduction, this will all come up again in Genesis 49. But what's worth noting here is that what seems to motivate his ire is it's not the deception. He's not upset that they betrayed this pledge that they had made to Hamor and Shechem. He's not particularly angry about a citywide murder. And he's not concerned about the blasphemous misuse of God's covenant sign. What bothers Jacob is the way this will inconvenience him, and it might put him in harm's way. He's afraid that the other inhabitants of the land they're not going to like him anymore. They're not going to like him dwelling there, and they may decide to hurt him. He does not seem at all the least bit concerned about his daughter. He's not concerned about the dead men of Shechem city or their women and children who have been taken in by his sons. He's concerned about his reputation, his own skin. His rebuke is stern. But he doesn't get the last word, at least not here. In Genesis 34, he's not given the last word. His sons are. And this the he in the final sentence, should he treat our sister like a prostitute? It's unclear to whom are they referring. Are they speaking this directly to Jacob in reply? Should he, Shechem, treat our sister like a prostitute? Or it's possible that they're asking the question to one another. He said his piece, and so the conversation's over. And so to one another, they ask, should he, Jacob, treat our sister like a prostitute? It's left a bit open-ended, perhaps to criticize both Jacob and Shechem. But either way, in giving the last word to the brothers, at least here in Genesis 34, the narrator means for Jacob to be viewed rather critically. But what about Simeon and Levi? We may acknowledge that Jacob is wrong in his reasons for being angry, but were they right in what they did? On the one hand, you kind of get it. I don't have a daughter or sister, but anger seems appropriate here. Seeking after justice seems appropriate here. The death of Shechem is almost certainly what the Old Testament law would have prescribed. He had done an outrageous thing in Israel, which is, we already noted it. In other places, it describes capital crimes. In Deuteronomy 22, 25 through 27, we have a mandate of the death penalty for the man who sexually forces himself upon a woman, as Shechem has done here. Now, there's more in that passage in Deuteronomy that we can discuss here, but suffice to say, all things considered, Shechem should well have been executed for what he did. Slaying the entire city is probably a disproportionate response, however. More on that in a minute. But the real issue at hand with Simeon and Levi, though, even if Jacob seems to miss it entirely, is the mockery that they make of God's covenant sign by using it as a tool of deception and death. The rite of circumcision was to be for Israel a sign of God's covenant with them, and among other things, it signified the need of what Deuteronomy 10:16 later will call a circumcision of the heart. Now, we are Baptists after all, so I don't want to draw too straight a line between circumcision and baptism. But a similar act today might be using baptism to drown someone. In effect, that's what they did. And so while we may find ourselves quite sympathetic with their anger and their desire for justice, Simeon and Levi, at a minimum, because of the way they went about it, they are not models for us to follow here. And this seems clear enough in the way that Genesis ends later in chapter 49, or ends in 50, but in 49 where they are condemned in a final word about them here. Now I know someone's thinking, but what about Phinehas and the Midianites? I think it'll be better to save that discussion for Genesis 49. So for now, I simply want to acknowledge the point of Genesis 34. There aren't any good guys here, really. Jacob is passive and self-centered. Dinah, perhaps a bit imprudent. Shechem is callous and cruel and arrogant and, at best, severely lacking in self-control. Hamor is corrupt and greedy. The people of his city are not any better. Simeon and Levi are rage-filled blasphemers, and their brothers are opportunistic pirates. So, can we draw any lessons from this? Yes. Probably many, but I have two. First, poor parenting puts children in harm's way. This is true in regards to both Dinah and her brothers. Had Jacob not shown such favoritism in his home, perhaps Dinah may have been spared from her awful fate. While Dinah's going out because of her interest in the women of the land may indeed reflect negatively on her, Jacob, her father, should have provided better instruction and protection for her. Jacob's preferences continue to bear bad fruit in his family. If it had been the child of another wife, or Rachel in particular, would he have responded differently? The only guess we can have is almost certainly. He certainly responds differently later when he thinks Joseph has been harmed. But bad fruit will continue to be born in his family's life. Hamor, likewise, he doesn't do his son or his household or his city any favors by refusing to rebuke at a minimum Shechem for his wicked behavior. He goes right along with it. And whatever criticism we should make of Jacob prior to Dinah's humiliation, he is clearly passive and self-interested after the fact. His passivity provokes a disproportionate and probably disproportionate and definitely blasphemous response from his sons as they seek to avenge their sister's honor. Now, they're clearly at fault for their actions, but we must not fail to note Jacob's responsibility for the situation. He said nothing and put them in an uncomfortable spot where they made mistakes, big ones. And then he shows selfishness in response to their sin. But we don't just see Jacob as playing favorites or as passive or having selfish interest. Why is Jacob living in Shechem to begin with? A result of partial obedience. Jacob had entered the promised land, but he stopped short of Bethel. The God of Bethel had called him to return to the land in 31:3. He had vowed to come back to Bethel in Genesis 28, but he stopped short at the end of chapter 33, seemingly for the sake of commercial gain. We saw something similar with Abraham's father. He stopped short of going all the way to Canaan from Haran. And the consequences for him were seemingly somewhat minimal. But the consequences for Jacob were disastrous. His teenage daughter is defiled. His sons, Simeon and Levi, while they don't end up totally excluded from the nation altogether, they disqualify themselves from receiving any actual inheritance in the land. And so, parents, are you seeking to obey God fully when it comes to raising your children? Are you taking responsibility to instruct your children well? To defend them when they need it, to respond to their sin appropriately, because it offends God and wounds others, not merely because of how it affects you. Yes, as our children get older, their actions are increasingly their own. And it is true that sometimes great parents end up with sons and daughters who prove to be rotten adults, or terrible parents who end up with sons and daughters who are wonderful adults. But we need to be careful not to look for excuses in our own failures as parents and blame our children for them, whatever they may be. And children, likewise, don't overreact to the failure of your parents. But a second lesson to draw from this is a lesson that we've seen over and over again in this book. God's will always be accomplished. Simeon and Levi's actions, I think, should be viewed as disproportionate because while the text seems to condemn their actions do prohibit assimilation with the Canaanites. And this means that they overcome the threat against God's people and God's plan of salvation, and that's a good thing. But at no point are they actually commanded here. Now later, there's commands given to destroy these nations, but not yet. And so killing these men and taking everything that belonged to them is a disproportionate response to the sin of Shechem. But the good that comes out of it, that Israel survives, it really only reinforces the idea that Genesis has shown us over and over again. God strikes a straight blow with a crooked stick. He always accomplished his purposes, even through human sin and failure. So there really isn't any basis here or elsewhere for approving of their actions as righteously motivated or righteously governed. But there is a reason in this passage to hope in God. Because of Levi's unrestrained anger, the Levites, as Jacob says in Genesis 49, will be scattered throughout Israel, meaning that in the end they won't have any portion in the land. But as we'll see, or consider then, by God's grace and through their loyalty to God after the golden calf incident in Exodus 32, which is exemplified further in Numbers 25 and 31 with Phinehas and the Midianites, the tribe of Levi is restored. They are appointed priests for service unto God. God brings beauty from ashes. And all of this points us to Jesus, the Messiah, a priest of a greater order than the Aaronic priesthood, than the tribe of Levi. He's a priest after the order of Melchizedek, as we've discussed previously in Genesis. He restores sinners to a privileged position, and he does so in his priestly work on the cross, where he, at the cost of his own life, exchanged our sin for his righteousness, so that in him we may become the blessing of Abraham to the nations. We may obtain it and become a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God, that we may declare the praises of him who called us out of darkness into his wonderful light. And so Genesis 34 shows us a lot of seedy behavior, twisted characters, unrighteous motives, and says, look beyond it. Look beyond them. Look beyond Levi to his descendants, the priest of Israel under the Old Covenant. But look beyond them to the descendant of one of Levi's brothers, Judah, his descendant, who would be the great high priest for all of God's people. So this is a difficult chapter, painful to read, but it does us much good in seeing the great wisdom and power of God to bring about his purposes in the earth, particularly as we consider everything that follows from it. Well, amen.